Silent Rider, and Coke Doctor, names whispered in fear but never spoken aloud, were the shadowy figures behind one of the UK's most secretive and violent cocaine empires. For years they ruled from the shadows of Liverpool's Cartel farm estate, orchestrating shipments worth millions while leaving no trace. But what happens when the silent kings of the drug trade are suddenly exposed, their encrypted world shattered by a single leak? This is the story of the Houghton firm, an empire built on loyalty, secrecy, and ruthless power, and the explosive fall that no one saw coming. In the early 2000s, a quiet storm began to brew in the outskirts of Liverpool, in a place known as Cartel Farm, later renamed Stockbridge Village. A group of young men was slowly building the foundations of one of the most elusive and powerful cocaine operations in British history. Cartel Farm had long been known for poverty, high crime, and few opportunities. It was a place people survived, not thrived. But within its maze of grey housing blocks and boarded-up shops, something else was taking shape, something far more organized than petty theft or gang scuffles. The men who would form the core of what would later be called the Houghton firm didn't look like criminals destined for infamy. They didn't wear designer clothes or throw wild parties. They didn't post pictures online or make music videos flaunting wealth. They kept to themselves, studied the streets, watched who controlled what, and learned from the failures of gangs before them. They understood one simple rule: real power doesn't shout, it whispers. Their early operations were small. They acted as middlemen, picking up parcels from known suppliers and distributing them through trusted local dealers. But their real skill wasn't in the dealing, it was in staying invisible. They recruited only those they grew up with. Loyalty was everything. Paranoia was encouraged. No one talked unless it was face-to-face. No texts, no calls, no loose ends. By 2006, the group had already established a pipeline that reached far beyond Liverpool. Connections were made with Dutch importers and Balkan traffickers. These weren't gang members, they were businessmen, and the Houghton firm respected that. Within a few short years, they moved from street dealers to wholesale distributors. They weren't fighting over corners, they were supplying those who were. They began to invest in legitimate-looking businesses: car washes, taxi firms, gyms. The money flowed in, but the silence remained. No one in the community could quite say who was in charge. Rumors spread, but no names were ever confirmed. People knew better than to ask questions. Behind the estate's crumbling exterior, a criminal enterprise was growing, one built on trust, fear, and a kind of discipline rarely seen in the underworld. The Houghton firm had arrived. The Houghton firm's power didn't come from violence alone, it came from logistics. While other groups fought over turf and clashed on the streets, the firm focused on building something far more sophisticated: a seamless, invisible supply chain that stretched from foreign ports to British towns. By 2011, they had transformed into a wholesale operation, moving cocaine by the hundreds of kilos, hidden in plain sight, routed through a network few could trace. It began at the docks. Liverpool, a port city with deep trade routes across Europe and beyond, offered countless opportunities to move product under the radar. The firm secured trusted insiders, dock workers, freight handlers, even customs agents. Containers would arrive labeled as frozen meat, electrical appliances, or imported tiles. Inside, tightly wrapped cocaine bricks were hidden in false compartments or tucked into pallets. Nothing looked out of place, and everything moved on schedule. Once unloaded, the drugs didn't stay in the city. They were quickly moved to stash houses across Merseyside, Cheshire, and rural parts of Lancashire. These were ordinary-looking homes, or small farm buildings, rented under false names, often occupied by individuals who had no idea what was stored inside. There, the cocaine was broken down, repackaged, and made ready for delivery. From these stash points, drivers, often paid couriers who knew little about the people they worked for, would transport the drugs across the country. Manchester, Leeds, Sheffield, Birmingham, even as far as Edinburgh and Cardiff, wherever demand existed, the Houghton firm supplied it. Their operations ran like clockwork, avoiding unnecessary contact, never repeating the same route twice, and always staying one step ahead. They didn't rely on street dealers. Instead, they sold in bulk to regional crews who handled local distribution. This meant less visibility, fewer risks, and more control. Their buyers respected the professionalism and feared the consequences of betrayal. Payment was always up front, usually in cash, sometimes in diamonds or high-end goods. Police and rival gangs alike struggled to trace them. They weren't flashy, didn't claim territory, and avoided public feuds. They didn't want to be known. They wanted to be rich, protected, and untouchable. And for nearly a decade, their plan worked better than anyone could have predicted. By 2016, the Houghton firm had reached a level where secrecy was no longer just smart. It was essential. The stakes were higher, the quantities larger, and the money staggering. A single mistake could mean a decades-long sentence or a violent end. So they turned to technology. What began as paranoia became precision. Encrypted communication became their new weapon, and it changed everything. At first, they used PGP BlackBerry devices, basic but secure, allowing messages to be sent without leaving a trace. But as law enforcement caught on, the firm adapted. They shifted to a new system that promised even tighter security. EncroChat. These phones were expensive, often costing thousands of pounds, and could only be accessed by those invited in. Messages were sent through private servers, conversations were automatically deleted, and there was no connection to user identity. For the Houghton firm, it was a dream come true. Every major player within the organization received one. Real names were banned. Instead, they used aliases, cold, calculated handles like Frostace, Coke Doctor, Silent Rider. Each name represented a role, a region, or a... Through these devices, they coordinated massive shipments, arranged pickups, confirmed payments, and negotiated new deals with international suppliers. The language they used was coded, often dry and vague to outsiders, but rich with meaning to those inside the loop. A single message could trigger the movement of £1 million worth of cocaine. Another might confirm a gun drop, or issue a warning to a crew that owed money. Everything was tracked, measured, and stored in memory only. There were no records on paper, no meetings that weren't absolutely necessary. Trust was everything, and betrayal was dealt with quietly and quickly. This digital evolution allowed them to expand without ever stepping out of the shadows. Operations in the Midlands, Wales, and Scotland were now handled remotely. Couriers received drop instructions. Payments were confirmed with single-word replies. Surveillance became nearly impossible. To the outside world, the Houghton firm didn't exist. There were no leaders to follow, no meetings to intercept, no conversations to overhear. Behind the encrypted screens, however, they were running one of the most organized drug empires the UK had ever seen. As the Houghton firm's empire grew, so did the threats to it. With millions flowing through their network each month, it was only a matter of time before rivals took notice. Crews from Manchester, Birmingham, and even London started pushing into territories long supplied by the firm. Some tried to poach clients. Others attempted to undercut their prices. A few made the fatal mistake of using intimidation. The response was swift, brutal, and left no room for interpretation. The Houghton firm didn't announce their presence. They didn't spray graffiti, wear gang colors, or post warnings online. Instead, they sent messages through fear. In one incident, a car belonging to a rival crew member exploded outside a pub in Wavertree. No one was killed, but everyone understood the message. This was not a game. Another man was found floating in a canal in Warrington, hands bound, a bullet lodged behind his ear. Whispers on the street blamed the firm. The police had no suspects, and no one willing to talk. Violence wasn't used recklessly, it was strategic. The firm had rules, and if you broke them, the consequences were final. Even within their own network, discipline was enforced with terrifying efficiency. A courier caught skimming money disappeared. A middleman who missed a delivery window was found beaten and warned once. There would be no second time. But the firm didn't rely on fear alone. They began absorbing smaller crews across the country, offering stability, steady supply, and protection. Gangs in Nottingham, Leeds and Sheffield began operating under the firm's umbrella. They were allowed to run their own street-level business, but product had to be sourced exclusively from Whiten. Prices were non-negotiable. Payment was expected on time. With their expanding influence came the need for weapons. Firearms were smuggled in alongside drugs or purchased from Eastern European traffickers. Safe houses doubled as armories, storing handguns, submachine guns, and silencers. But the goal was always control, not chaos. The threat of violence was more useful than its execution. By 2018, the firm was no longer just a Liverpool-based operation. They were a national force, respected by some, feared by most, and invisible to many. Their message was simple: loyalty would make you rich, disloyalty would make you disappear. Behind every criminal empire lies a money man, and for the Houghton firm, that man was known only as the accountant. He wasn't from Cantrell Farm. He didn't grow up in the estate or earn his stripes on the street. He was an outsider, a middle-aged financial advisor living a quiet life in a detached home in a sleepy Lancashire village. To his neighbors, he was polite, punctual, and unremarkable. But behind closed doors, he was the one turning millions in dirty cash into clean, traceable wealth. The accountant's job was simple in theory, but complex in practice: make vast amounts of cocaine money disappear into the legal economy. Over the years, he became an expert at creating fake invoices, setting up shell companies, and routing funds through offshore bank accounts. In places like Panama, patterns emerged: routes for shipments, key players involved in logistics, and the brutal enforcement tactics employed against those who crossed the firm. Perhaps most alarming was the scale of money moving through the network. Encrochat messages detailed hundreds of millions of pounds in sales, confirming the firm's role as one of the largest cocaine wholesalers in the UK. But alongside the profits, the conversations exposed violent acts, threats, and even plans to eliminate rival dealers. The network's infiltration was a game-changer. For years, the Houghton firm had operated in silence, shielded by technology. Now their every move was exposed. What had once been an invisible, untouchable criminal organization was suddenly vulnerable, and the countdown to their downfall had begun. With the Encrochat breach providing a wealth of intelligence, the National Crime Agency launched a covert operation called Operation Velvet Axe. The goal was clear: dismantle the Houghton firm completely, from the street-level dealers up to the shadowy bosses hidden behind layers of encryption and false identities. Planning took months, relying on the painstaking work of surveillance teams, undercover officers, and cyber experts piecing together the fragments of the firm's network. The operation was massive and delicate. Targets were spread across at least 18 cities in England, Scotland, and Wales, including Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, and Glasgow. Officers moved carefully to avoid tipping off suspects. Every movement was tracked, every communication monitored. Undercover agents infiltrated courier networks, posing as buyers or runners, gaining trust to reveal key players and stash locations. When the raids finally began in June 2020, they struck swiftly and without warning. Dozens of addresses were hit in a coordinated wave. Warehouses filled with cocaine were uncovered, some holding over 40 kilograms at a time. Luxury vehicles paid for with dirty cash were seized. Police found hidden compartments in homes and garages, sometimes behind false walls or under floorboards. Guns and ammunition were discovered in several safe houses, evidence of the firm's readiness for violence. In Knowsley, a modest-looking house contained a ledger filled with detailed notes tracking shipments from October to December, listing quantities, prices, and contacts. This physical evidence, combined with the intercepted Encrochat messages, was enough to build a powerful case against the arrested individuals. Despite the success, the highest-ranking figures remained elusive. The so-called leaders, known only by their encrypted usernames, had avoided capture. They slipped away before raids or vanished into safe houses with pre-arranged warning systems. Their true identities were still a mystery, frustrating investigators and fueling speculation. But Operation Velvet Axe marked a turning point. The arrests disrupted distribution networks, slowed the flow of cocaine, and sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld. The Houghton firm was no longer untouchable. The net was tightening, and the organization's days of operating in the shadows were numbered. Even after the sweeping arrests during Operation Velvet Axe, the true masterminds behind the Houghton firm remained ghosts. The men known by their encrypted handles, Frostace, Coke Doctor, Silent Rider, managed to stay hidden, slipping through the fingers of law enforcement despite the growing pressure. Their ability to vanish was almost as impressive as the empire they had built, raising questions about how deeply their influence ran. While some believed the leaders had fled the UK, investigators found evidence suggesting they stayed closer to home than expected. One operated under an alias in a sleek Manchester apartment, blending into the city's thriving business district. Another appeared as a legitimate used car dealer in Liverpool, dealing in high-end vehicles by day while managing shipments by night. Their identities were carefully disguised, supported by a network of loyal associates who ensured their locations remained secret. Encrochat leaks continued to provide glimpses behind their masks. Voice notes, with disguised voices, photos of luxury watches, piles of cash, and encrypted messages hinting at their movements kept the police focused on tracking these elusive figures. One breakthrough came when officers identified a penthouse in Leeds after matching a photograph of a Rolex and a marble table found in intercepted messages. Inside, a hidden wall safe contained hundreds of messages directly linked to Silent Rider, revealing not only shipment schedules but detailed financial transactions. Despite these clues, capturing the leaders proved difficult. They used burner phones, false passports, and safe houses equipped with advanced security systems. Their communications were minimal and strictly coded, often using misdirection to throw off surveillance. Even trusted lieutenants rarely met face-to-face with them. The network was built on layers of protection, designed to withstand infiltration and delay police progress. Their continued freedom frustrated authorities, but also highlighted the firm's resilience. They had adapted quickly to every threat, relying on secrecy, technology, and loyalty. The battle was far from over. Behind closed doors, the firm's leaders prepared for the inevitable showdown, knowing that every move they made was now under a microscope. The game had changed, but they still held cards no one else could see. As 2021 unfolded, cracks began to show within the Houghton firm's carefully constructed fortress. The pressure from law enforcement, combined with internal tensions, started to unravel what once seemed unbreakable. Several key arrests during Operation Velvet Axe had created power vacuums, and some mid-level operatives began jockeying for control. The silence that had protected the firm was replaced by whispers of mistrust and betrayal. The once unified network became fragmented. Couriers and dealers who had been loyal now feared they were being watched, worried about who might talk to the police next. Some members disappeared, refusing to answer calls or respond to encrypted messages. Rumors spread that a few had flipped, providing information in exchange for leniency. This uncertainty sparked violent reprisals, with a number of unexplained shootings and assaults linked to settling scores within the organization. Meanwhile, law enforcement exploited these weaknesses. Using the intelligence gathered from Encrochat and the recent raids, they intensified surveillance on remaining suspects. They monitored financial transactions more closely, tracing money flows through layers of shell companies and legitimate businesses. This approach slowly squeezed the firm's ability to operate openly, cutting off some supply routes and disrupting payment chains. The Houghton firm tried to adapt. They moved away from Encrochat, switching to even more secure platforms like Sky ECC. They tightened vetting processes, demanding stricter loyalty and cutting off anyone suspected of disloyalty. Yet, the damage was done. The police had learned how the network worked, and they were closing in on the few leaders still free. In a surprising twist, one of the firm's own accountants was revealed to have secretly worked with investigators for months, feeding critical information. His betrayal gave police a clearer picture of the financial web that underpinned the empire, helping to identify properties, assets, and associates previously unknown. By late 2021, the once invisible empire was weakening under the weight of law enforcement pressure and internal collapse. The Houghton firm's reign was slipping away, and the underground kingdom built on secrecy, fear, and loyalty was beginning to crumble from within. By early 2022, the Houghton firm faced a reckoning unlike anything before. After years of operating in the shadows, mastering secrecy, technology, and violence, their empire was collapsing from every side. Law enforcement's relentless pursuit, combined with betrayals from within, had dismantled the once feared organization piece by piece. The story of the firm was no longer one of untouchable power, but a cautionary tale of how even the most secretive empires can fall. The final blows came in a series of dramatic raids across the UK. Authorities arrested dozens of remaining members, including some high-ranking lieutenants who had tried to hold the fractured organization together. Safe houses were emptied, luxury cars seized, and millions of pounds in cash and assets frozen. The evidence collected was overwhelming: financial records, encrypted messages, weapons and drugs. Prosecutors were armed with a mountain of proof that left little room for doubt. Trials that followed revealed the inner workings of the Houghton firm in chilling detail. Witnesses testified about coded communications, brutal enforcement tactics, and the vast scale of cocaine trafficking. The organization's reach, spanning cities, counties, and borders, was laid bare. The impact on communities was stark. Addiction, violence, and fear left scars that would take years to heal. But even as the leaders faced long prison sentences, questions remained about the vacuum left behind. Could the firm simply be replaced by new criminal groups? Would the demand for cocaine fuel another empire rising from the ashes? Authorities warned that the fight against organized crime was far from over. For many, the downfall of the Houghton firm was a victory, proof that patience, technology, and cooperation could bring justice. But it was also a reminder that such criminal enterprises are complex, adaptive, and often deeply embedded in communities. The story of the firm showed how a group of quiet men from a forgotten Liverpool estate built one of the UK's most powerful cocaine empires, and how, eventually, even the most secretive organizations can be brought into the light. The legacy of the Houghton firm remains a stark warning. No empire, no matter how well hidden,